Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Francine Schertzer. Today we'll talk about Governor Josh Shapiro's budget proposals for education. You can join our discussion by calling us toll-free at 1-877-PA6-5001, or you can text us at 717-219-4001. But first, we're joined by John Baer, political columnist from Pennlive. Thanks for joining us, John.
Thanks for having me, Francine.
You wrote over the weekend, you characterized Governor Josh Shapiro's budget proposal as a, quote, epic ask, end quote, for a legislature used to saying no. Just to back up, for those not familiar, how would you characterize the governor's relationship with the legislature during the first year of his term?
Well, it started out as okay, and then his last year's budget proceeded to its ultimate end. As you may recall, there was a little bit of mix-up on the voucher issue. The governor initially indicated his support for a voucher scholarship type system. When the House Democrats refused to go along with that, he line item vetoed it. Republicans said he had turned coat, had played games with them, and so we had an extended thing. So it was frosty. Now, the relationships aren't too bad. I mean, they're not eternally broken, but there is a clear distance in what the view of Pennsylvania's current financial condition is, what its future financial condition is, and really what its needs are. The Republican leadership in both chambers and the governor are a mile and a half apart on all of those issues.
What do you think the governor needs to do to restore the trust of particularly the leaders in the Republican caucuses?
Well, I mean, I don't think at this point, I don't think the trust thing is all that important. I mean, what he has to do is sell this very ambitious package that he's proposed, and he's going to have to give up something. I don't know if it's going to be vouchers, if it's going to be voter ID, if it's going to be some tweaking of business taxes that will benefit the business community. But this is a familiar story in Pennsylvania. If you look back at Governor Wolf's almost a decade ago, I mean, in 2015, Governor Wolf's first budget, what did he call for? He called for cutting the business tax. He called for cutting property taxes. He called for freezing tuition at state universities, just as Shapiro has done. He called for $1 billion in new money for K through 12 education, just as Shapiro has done. And he supported a hike in the minimum wage from $7.25. It was that then, it's that now. So there's a little bit of deja vu involved in all of these asks and all of these responses.
The governor is proposing to utilize roughly $3 billion from the Rainy Day Fund. How's that being received?
As usual, gloom and doom lies ahead. We need a rainy day fund. We need a fat rainy day fund. But look, we still have a bunch of COVID money around. So if you add up all of the surpluses, all of the bonuses, all the COVID money, all the rainy day fund, we're looking at $14 billion. The difference between Governor Wolf 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, was he wanted $3 billion in new taxes to pay for his program. Governor Shapiro has that money if the legislature would go along with it. And I'd note, Francine, today is the birthday of Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin. So the legislature needs to have some leadership qualities akin to Lincoln's and a little bit of evolution from its past of just saying no to every program that could benefit a ton of Pennsylvanians without really adding new taxes to the burdens.
You wrote that House Republican Whip Representative Tim O'Neill referred to this budget as, quote, an advertisement for a future presidential campaign, end quote. Have you seen evidence of theories that the governor is planning to run for president in the future?
I think the governor is doing what every smart, talented politician does, and that's just make sure he doesn't misstep along the way. Just just say, look, these are my talents, these are my abilities. I'm going to put them on display. Nobody says 5-8 years out, I'm going to run for president. But what you do is you position yourself on issues, be aggressive at home, be intelligent on national stuff. He already has a pretty good reputation here. His polling numbers are very good. He's gotten a lot of national attention from cable TV, from national journalists. So yeah, I mean, I thought that assessment was spot on. That speech had a national tone to it, a national quality, and his deliverance is certainly on that level as well.
During the governor's speech last week, he very briefly referenced his support to school vouchers. Once again, the very issue, as you mentioned, that was partly blamed for last year's impasse. Do you see the governor and/or legislative leaders addressing this issue differently this year?
I mean, there's no way to address it differently. It is what it is. The only question is there any wiggle room within the House Democratic caucus, whether Democrats will go along with it? Politically, I think they should. I think the issue is going to come no matter what someday. Why go against your governor's leadership and direction on this, given his polling numbers, given his stance? It could actually end up helping them politically. There are plenty of Democratic community leaders, some lawmakers, even in big cities, who see that as somewhat of a salvation for some kids.
The governor proposed various initiatives during his address last week. Are there any that jump out to you as obvious negotiating chips for the budget negotiations this year?
Well, there were two that jumped out to me as I don't know how you can be against them chips, which is a good place to start if you're going to have a whole number of things. The first was his proposal to spend $400 million to wipe away medical debt for people who can't afford to pay it, particularly in rural areas, which adding particularly in rural areas is a nice little lure for the Republican leaders and Republican lawmakers. It's tough to be against something like that. It's a very ambitious and bold idea and a good idea, and clearly there are a lot of people that could use that help. The second one was his proposal, very impassioned proposal, to reach out and improve the funding for home care and community-based care for those with autism or intellectual disabilities. That has always been a Republican niche. There's always been interest in those issues. Democrats, of course, have always been there in human services stuff. So I think if you start there, you might create an atmosphere of cooperation that could extend into other areas.
One last question. Do you think being an election year affects what lawmakers will be willing to approve?
I really don't, because the re-election rates of Pennsylvania lawmakers in the high 90s year after year after year. I don't think it makes much difference, which is why I never understood why they always refused to raise taxes. It wouldn't matter. They could do anything and get reelected. So I don't think it will be a big issue going forward.
John Baer, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Francine.
More of the PCN Capitol Preview after this short break.
I'm Dave Williams, your host here in Pennsylvania Country Roads. Come join me as we travel throughout the countryside of Pennsylvania, places that you love to see, the people you love to meet, and of course, the many wonderful things that go on in our state. All this and much more every Sunday morning at 7 a.m. on PCN TV.
Experience communities in action through lively and in-depth discussions on Inside Pennsylvania Boroughs. Join host Chris Kapp and his guests as they discuss important and timely issues from around the state. Gain valuable insight as experts share their thoughts on topics that matter most to you and your family. Get inspired to make a difference in your community by tuning in to Inside Pennsylvania Boroughs on Sundays right here on PCN.
Welcome back. Our guests are Hannah Barrick, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials, Sherri Smith, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators, and Donna Cooper, Executive Director of Children First. Donna, we'll start with you. Last week when Governor Shapiro made his budget proposal, he offered a $48.3 billion budget, roughly $1 billion dedicated to education. How responsive was his budget proposal to keeping in mind the Commonwealth Court decision last year saying that Pennsylvania schools were underfunded, and then separately the Basic Education Funding Commission recommendations? What are your thoughts?
Well, the governor's proposal is totally aligned with the majority report that came out of the Basic Education Funding Commission, which is a good sign. It indicates that the governor is staying true to his word that the Basic Education Funding Commission table was the place where he wanted to bring the parties together to reach agreement on how to solve for the school funding crisis. And so, in fact, about $1 billion is going to go through the new formula approach that was recommended by Basic Education Funding Commission, which both resets the data cell elements, so there's more smooth, like there's less volatility. So a school district doesn't have a sticker shock one year to another if their number of kids changes dramatically, or minor, not dramatically, or the number of kids in poverty change. But more to the point, it puts extraordinary resources into closing the equity gap between the districts that have the most and the districts that have the least. And that's a tremendous step forward compared to the experience that we've had for the last several years. Governor Wolf did a tremendous job funding the schools, but the structure of the formula, it would have taken easily 50 years to bring up the low wealth, high poverty districts to the level that's needed. And this is a step in the right direction. If we do this for the next 6 years, we will have met the threshold set by the court.
Sherri, your thoughts on the proposal?
Yeah, I have to concur with Donna's responses. The amount of funding that was put forward in his address was very positive for our schools and a great step forward. We appreciate the fact that he stayed true to his word to take the Basic Education Formula Commission's word on what was needed in that first year and put that into place for our schools this year. Certainly appreciate it and look forward to not only receiving those dollars, but looking at future years to ensure the equity of funding in our schools.
Hannah, I'd like to give you an opportunity to chime in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I concur as well. I think that, we're really happy to sort of see the significant additional state investment really targeted at K-12 education, really focused on responding to the Commonwealth Court decision. And now we sort of turn to, all right, we're going to have several months ahead of us to make sure that we can get to the end of this process and have that sort of be in place and really start the process and moving the needle on education funding.
Once again, I'd like to welcome our viewers to our discussion. If you'd like to join in and talk about the governor's budget proposals for education, you can call us toll free at 1-877-PA6-5001 or text us 717-219-4001. Hannah, I'll come back to you now just for a point of reference. How does Pennsylvania compare to other states in how our state funds education?
Yeah, so in Pennsylvania, and again, this is something that was really highlighted through the Commonwealth Court's decision and the school funding lawsuit. We as a state rely a lot on local revenue, and it really is dependent upon the wealth and the capacity of every local community, the resources that a school district has to be able to support their students and provide for their needs. And so, we've got state revenue, local revenue, and every one of our 500 school districts has a little bit of a different balance, which then means that every one of our 500 school districts is really able to provide different opportunities and resources to students. So this, again, the proposal moves the needle and really shifting and ensuring that the state is investing to make up for some of those adequacy gaps where they don't have the resources at the local community, and to really ensure that where the local community is providing the lion's share, there's also some recognition for the fact that the burden there is pretty significantly high on taxpayers. So this sort of moves Pennsylvania to a place where we have a little bit more balance in how we fund education, which is many other states have gone through this process with school funding lawsuits to really look at the way they fund education. So this is sort of our opportunity to move through that process as well.
The governor's proposal suggests using $3 billion of the rainy day fund to help fund all of his plans, not just specifically education. Is that a sustainable source of revenue to fund the long-term plan that he has in mind, or do you think ultimately he would have to raise taxes?
I will sort of take a stab at that. I mean, I think, we're certainly, as an association who represents school business officials, sustainability is really important. And ensuring that as we're putting resources from the state into schools, that needs to be there. It needs to be predictable. It needs to be sustainable over time. So I think those are some of the questions that folks are going to continue to ask, ensuring that as these dollars go in, they are reliable. Folks can use them to hire staff and to bring programs on board that they can, be sure that will be there in 3 years and 5 years and 7 years. So I know there's a lot of questions about that, out there that have been tossed around following the budget address. At the same time, the state does have a significant amount of sort of surplus funds, and being able to use some of those funds to push into the needs that we know we have in education is a good use of those funds, certainly.
How do you respond to Senate Republicans who say that money alone will not solve the education system's problems? Donna, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, the Senate Republicans in the minority report of the Basic Ed Funding Commission were very clear that we have to solve the adequacy gap. They did not argue the point that there are school districts where students are significantly disadvantaged in the quality of their education because of underfunding. So I feel like we're kind of past that. And if you want to ask, you want to look at the school funding formula that's being used as the Shapiro administration is moving forward, they took the top performing schools, and they said, what do they spend? And many of them are in Senate Republican communities and Senate Democrat communities. It's this issue of quality education exists in a bipartisan way. Some people have really, really high performing schools that have adequate resources. So the question is, yes, if you're spending $30,000 a kid, I think we would probably all agree that perhaps you don't need all that. But school districts like Reading, where they're at $10,000 a kid or so, their possibility of offering a quality education, given the economic status of the families coming and the many languages that are taught in the school and the share of parents who do not have high school diplomas, you're definitely going to have to spend more. And I don't think anybody in the House or the Senate is arguing that point anymore. I do think that with a $14 billion surplus between revenues that are coming in above expenditures and what's in the rainy day fund, the billion that's proposed for education, because not all of the spending in the governor's budget is around education, has a long trajectory in available resources when you think about $14 billion. And state revenues have been quite strong over the last 4 years. Obviously, we have to be good stewards of tax dollars. One of the things people say in this state over and over again when you poll them is the quality of a kid's education should not depend on their zip code. And so I think that any taxpayer that you talk to, it's a 9 out of 10 response on that, wants to see us close this adequacy gap. And we certainly have ample resources to do that in the near term.
Either of you like to address that as well?
Yeah, I think it's a good start, right? Having the amount of funding you need to provide the programs you need for students is obviously a good start for any other issues that schools are dealing with. So our schools that don't have the type of funding they need, they can't pay their teachers as much, and then they're not able to retain necessarily all those teachers. They eventually gravitate to schools that pay more, and there's just all kinds of ripple effects when you don't have the dollars to actually provide for the programs and the services that students need in those programs. So I say it's a good start, and then we've got work to do behind it when we do receive the dollars to be able to provide for the students that are in our schools.
Can I add one other thing about that, which I think Sherri makes a good point, a good start. In both the House and the Senate, in both the Republican and Democratic reports to the Basic Ed Funding Commission, they enumerated 28 practices that they think are really critical for kids to have in every school. And some of them are like general, like small class sizes, or specific, like full day kindergarten, or specific around how you teach reading. So basically, I think the question of is more money the answer? Well, in general, no. But behind these 28 practices, I'm making sure you have enough teachers, certified teachers to be in classrooms. I think that's a pretty widely held point of view where there's consensus.
In recent years, schools have called for physical structure needs as well, things like asbestos remediation, lead paint removal, and so forth. How much of that was addressed in last year's budget, and is there a continuing need to address this moving forward?
So in the budget that was just finalized in December, so for 23-24, there's $175 million targeted at school infrastructure, so environmental repairs and very needed improvements and upgrades. This proposed budget for 24-25 put forth another $300 million per year over 5 years that would be sort of added to that to be able to support the facilities, upgrades needs, environmental health and safety changes. So I think we're really optimistic about that. It's certainly something that is absolutely needed across all 500 school districts. It was something, again, that was highlighted in the Commonwealth Court decision, and really the learning spaces that kids are in across the Commonwealth is very inequitable. So I think that's really important, really positive, and I think that's something that we've been hearing from our members, certainly across the Commonwealth, that very much needed. Folks are excited about that.
Can you talk a little bit about the separation between state versus local funding, how school funding is computed?
Yeah. So, every school district has builds their budget every year, and their budget sort of expenditures equal revenues. Those revenues are going to be divided by what they get from the state, what they get from the federal government, which is a relatively small portion, and then the rest, and that gap is generally closed by what they can raise at the local level through property taxes or other sort of local taxes. So. It is, school districts have the capacity every year with pretty significant limitations on them to be able to raise any additional revenue they need through property taxes. They can't, raise it to 10% or anything like that. There are statutory requirements. There are caps every year for school district. There's a very sort of transparent process that they have to go through, and it starts in the fall, sort of developing their budget and providing that preliminary budget, and those discussions are happening in the local school board to sort of be able to make those decisions about what they're going to do. But the local component is generally kind of what fills the difference. So right now, the conversation is certainly positive for school districts. The potential of a pretty significant investment in state revenue really mitigates the need to sort of focus and close any gaps at the local level. But that is, I think, the balance and the conversation and the sort of math problem that school districts across the Commonwealth are doing right now.
Sherri, can you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of state versus local control?
Well, I always say if you know one district in Pennsylvania, you know one district in Pennsylvania. We all have different dynamics that we're dealing with, and what our community needs are, and honestly, what our communities want out of their public schools. So, you have to be very careful from a state level how much you try to treat all the same. But the one thing I do know is that all students deserve the type of education that gets them to where they want to be in their careers post high school, and that's our responsibility to do that. So certainly there's a need for state consistency in certain ways, but when you look at the details of how you the programs that you have and the systems that you put into place, it truly does need local control to be able to do that. So there's a delicate balance, to be honest with you, to make sure you don't really treat every school the same from a state level when it comes to programs and services that are needed, but at the same token, you need it sometimes because you want to make sure that all the schools across the Commonwealth have the dollars and the services and the programs that students need to be successful.
I'd like to pick through some of the specific line items in the governor's proposal. His address proposes $100 million toward providing mental health resources. Donna, is that adequate?
Well, look, it's a good start, as Sherri said about the other funding. One of the things that's very troubling in Pennsylvania is that the majority of children who attempt or commit suicide have never presented to the mental health system before they take their life or try to do so. So we have across the state a significant challenge with mental health with kids. And these resources, this $100 million, once distributed across 500 school districts, becomes very small in each one of these school districts. But they can be used for critical training of school personnel to recognize the kinds of signs that a kid's in trouble, that they need help. But we really do need the Commonwealth to embrace really ambitious and build a mental health system that, akin to a physical health system, offers ready access to children, lots of professionals who are trained to do this work, that are ready to meet the needs from whether they're little kids who have specific kinds of mental health challenges to kids in puberty and teenagers who have very different. And some communities, people are dealing with trauma. Some communities, people are dealing with families that have had histories of addiction. And some people are struggling in schools where they're being bullied. And so we have a variety of needs. And I would say to all the lawmakers and citizens that the $100 million that is proposed begins to create the first step on the stairs of creating a real mental health system for our children.
Has the need for mental health resources grown since the pandemic?
Oh my goodness, yes, absolutely. So it's probably one of the biggest concerns that we have in our schools right now is the level of mental health concerns of our children, and honestly with staff and with our communities too, right? So the pandemic was very tough on all of us emotionally. So I agree with Don. It's a good start on the dollars for the $100 million for our schools, but there needs to be a full contingency of services. And that includes what is the community providing for those services for our students for mental health. Our schools are a great start to be able to support those, but what are the county services and what are the other providers in the community to ensure that we're doing a total wraparound of our students and ensuring that they continue to, let's say, move out of the pandemic mindset and become more stable and get back on track. And I think we're making some great inroads in that. We've put some great programs in our schools, but I can tell you that in my discussions with superintendents across the state is, we're taxing all the services that we're putting into place with that $100 million, that there's such a significant need for our kids.
The governor proposes $50 million for school safety and security. How does this compare to prior years?
That's what we for 23-24, same amount of money, $50 million. And again, that's really targeted at physical safety and security. Beginning, I think, in 2018, there was a large push and a focus for school safety and security, starting with physical safety. So we have seen those grant funds available over time. And I think, while we're still seeing the funds for physical safety, the shift is certainly moving to mental health, which is certainly important.
Another line item, $50 million for special education funding. How does special education fit into the formula?
Yeah, so that'd be one place where I would hope that we could put more funding in place. Our numbers of students and level of student needs in special education have truly spiked. And $50 million really doesn't even touch the increases in costs that we're seeing for our schools. So the special education formula is a separate formula from the basic education formula, and it's a good formula, and it actually supports schools differently in different schools based on what their particular needs are. So, I would hope that $50 million, thank you very much, we appreciate it, but truly I wish there would be more dollars put into that formula based on the current needs in our schools.
The governor's proposing $3 million to provide free menstrual hygiene products for students in schools. Why has this become an issue?
Well, it's really important issue for some school districts where girls are going to school from low-income families who cannot afford personal hygiene products. And it's a reason girls aren't coming to school. So one of the things we need to do is remove any barrier to school attendance and make sure that girls know that they can get their needs met at school. Now, again, at some point, we have to recognize that schools can't do everything. And when it comes to mental health or personal hygiene products, the community has a very key role. But I think this is putting a marker on the fact that girls have special challenges and special needs, and we as a society have been blind to those for a long time. So I commend the administration for being right out there in front and saying, any reason a girl doesn't come to school associated with personal hygiene products, let's get the resources out there to help them.
The governor's also proposing $2.7 million additional for Head Start supplemental programs, and an additional $30 million for pre-K counts. How does access to pre-K programs impact students' ability to move forward and progress as they go through the basic education system?
Well, look, one of the best investments any public dollar can be made is in early learning. It's when people's brains are developing the fastest and where it's the least expensive to affect developmental processes. So I'm old. For me to learn a new language is going to be really hard. For a child who's 4 or 5, it's pretty easy. As hard as it seems, it's easier for them than me or many listeners. So the governor proposed this increase in pre-K and Head Start, which is super important because it not only readies children for school, but it also has been demonstrated, to Sherri's earlier point, reduce the demand on special ed resources. Now, look, in Pennsylvania, still 60% of our children are starting school without access to high quality pre-K programs. That puts an added burden on our school districts we would see more efficiency with our basic ed and special ed dollars if every kid was given access to basic pre-K and Head Start. It's terrific that the governor proposed this. This is an area where there's been long bipartisan support. We've had probably 19 years of continuous appropriation, but we have a long way to go to make sure every kid has that smart start in life.
Donna, I'm going to come right back to you for a moment. If you could talk on a related item, the role of affordable daycare and those type of programs and what that role plays as a student is growing and getting into the regular basic education system.
So the state and federal government share a majority of the responsibility for funding childcare for families who are in the working poor or at the beginning of getting into the middle class. So people earning under $40,000, $45,000, the state and federal government put subsidies in place. And the subsidies, while they are welcome, are not high enough to solve for the thousands of teacher vacancies in the childcare sector. And when there are vacancies in the childcare sector, childcare classrooms are closed and children can't get in. Now, if it's a high quality childcare program, and Pennsylvania has many of those, if they're a toddler or an infant, they're going to get developmental support. If there isn't a pre-K program near where you live, they can be in a high quality childcare program. And they're in childcare after pre-K, because that's during school hours, or in the summer. So this is a really critical system for early brain development and making sure our kids are as healthy and ready for school as possible. And this is a place where the governor's budget was less ambitious than other governors across the country that have put hundreds of millions of dollars in place to solve the shortage of childcare workers. And just to put a point on that, there are 26,000 families who were on a waiting list for childcare in December. Probably hasn't softened at all. So we know that we have a labor force shortage because the wage rate in childcare, the most important time of a kid's brain development, is about $12 an hour, 12, 13. And you can get a job almost anywhere else, paying more than that.
We're going to continue our discussion in just a moment, but first I'd like to give our guests a brief break and tell you about what's coming up on PCN. The PCN Capitol Preview returns tomorrow to discuss business and the state budget with David Taylor, President and CEO of the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association, and Greg Moreland, Pennsylvania State Director of the National Federation of Independent Business. That's tomorrow morning, live at 9 a.m. Join us for On the Issues this week as we sit down with candidates for U.S. Senate and Congress. We'll be joined by U.S. Senate candidates Blaine Faulkner and Brandy Tomasetti and congressional candidates Mark Houck and Bob Forbes. That's Wednesday night starting at 6. This Thursday, Journalist Roundtable features Lindsay Weber from The Morning Call, Lauren Make from NBC 10 in Philadelphia, and Mark Levy from the Associated Press. That's Thursday night at 6. If you enjoy PCN's coverage of politics and policy, sign up for our political newsletter, The Capitol Review. There you'll find highlights of the day's news, along with links to live event coverage and PCN original shows. To subscribe, visit PCNTV.com. Thank you for watching PCN. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network that receives no government funding. We're relying on viewers and donors like you to help PCN continue to bring you everything Pennsylvania. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. Now, as we get back into our discussion, Sherri, I'd like to come back to you. How are schools doing with hiring and maintaining staff, particularly teachers?
Yeah, that's another one of the big issues that our schools are dealing with right now, on both sides. So the recruitment, the number of students, or I should say young adults coming out of schools with a teaching degree, continues to be very low. We had just a little over 5,000 individuals that came out, and that's down from like 10 years ago. So 1,000 out of Pennsylvania. So the amount of our certified teachers coming out is extremely low for us, and we've got to do a great job, and we're trying to, through our Grow Your Own teacher programs across the Commonwealth, to get our students interested in education. And then on the retainment end, we've got also some higher spikes in that than we've ever had. 7.7% of our teachers left education last year. That's the highest it's ever been. So not a certainly retaining retaining our teachers and trying to keep them into our classrooms through a positive culture and climate in our schools is something that we work on every single day. And then working to get our young adults or others with a second degree that would love to get into education and make a difference with our youth is something that we really need to recruit and get them into education.
Reminder, we're taking your calls, 1-877-PA6-5001, or text us, 717-219-4001. Linda is calling from West Grove. Go ahead, Linda.
Hey, I was just calling about the funding for the schools. Are they going to start teaching school? Or are they going to teach the other crap that they've been teaching? And are we going to get parents be able to pick the school they want to send their kids to? I mean, this is my taxpayer money.
I suspect the caller may be talking a little bit about vouchers and school choice. As you may recall, last year, the governor, one of the issues of contention in the budget impasse was the PASS scholarship program, which has been described some akin to vouchers. Is that something that you see moving forward? Is there a will for that?
I mean, I think it's something that while there was not dollars put into the budget for it this year, Governor Shapiro mentioned it as part of his budget address and sort of indicated that, there were still, some in this process that have that as a priority. And it was something that he indicated he would like to see get across the finish line. That said, I think there's a significant amount of opposition to that. And I think, we were, I think, pleasantly surprised that there was not a sort of dollar amount included in the budget for that, really focusing on, let's take these additional state dollars, let's focus on ensuring that we are investing in the public education system to ensure that we can provide every kid who's attending a public school with the resources and the opportunities that they need. So I suspect that we will, as we go forward to the end of June, have a lot more conversations on that, since it is not something that is off the table. And I think we're gearing up for those discussions, certainly.
I'd like to revert to an early part of our discussion just a few moments ago. Sherri, you were talking a little bit about teacher retention and maintenance. The governor had proposed $5 million for additional, which would be a total of $15 million for a student-teacher stipend. Is that something that's helpful, or are there other initiatives that you think would really help to bring people into the profession?
I think that's a great discussion and I think a great start again. So, one of the things that we've heard, particularly for our second degree folks, is that they currently have a job, they're going in and getting a degree in teaching, and when you student teach, there's no really opportunity to hold any other job. It's a pretty intensive time period. So they have to let go. Many of them have families, and obviously you need money to survive yourself individually. So the fact that we're putting those stipends into place, it's $10,000, or depending on where they go, it could be up to $15,000 for someone who's student teaching to receive those dollars so they can sustain in their personal life while they're going through the student teaching removes one of the barriers that our folks have getting into education. So definitely appreciate that. That's a great start, and I know that will be appreciated to our young adults who are doing that. The overall cost of education for a teacher to get their certification, to get into the realm of teaching, many times, as we know, it takes many, many years, up to sometimes age 40 or greater, for them to pay off those loans. And when, some of our teachers are not paid a very high salary. So they just to sustain and be able to pay off those, you have to ask the economics is it worth getting into the education into education as a profession. So I think it's really important for us to look at all those barriers and remove it. The student teaching is one of them, but we've got many more to overcome.
Dawn, are there active efforts to diversify the teacher workforce as well?
Well, there are. There's two ways that that's happening. One is by increasing the recruitment efforts by the higher ed universities for students of color or students who are coming from different communities, cities, rural, suburban. We need all kinds of diversity, class, race, in our schools. And one of the things that's also happening, though, is that independent of the state budget, but with resources from philanthropy, higher ed is beginning to think about how it is preparing teachers so that they can recognize the experience and the cultural richness that students bring with them to school and recognize and welcome that in their classrooms, so that a child coming from Albania might have a cultural experience to share, and they might feel lonely if they can't, and so they begin to withdraw. And the same might go for a kid from Mexico. And so how do teachers begin to use the cultural experiences of students who are coming and bring that into the classroom in ways that really welcome kids and make them see themselves in their educational process? We have a long way to go. Today, the story on the front page of the Inquirer was an exodus of teachers in charter and public schools in Philadelphia, and this is true across the state. And sadly, some of the people who are leaving are teachers who bring diversity to our school. Why are they leaving? One, they can get paid. Again, teacher salaries are in many districts, especially those that are low wealth, just simply not competitive with somebody can earn in the private market. And two, because they're not feeling like they can bring them full selves into work and make sure that they can be responsive to the needs of the children they serve. So in terms of teaching a kid to read and write and do their arithmetic and know their social studies, the more you can relate to a child, the easier it is for them to learn. Having diverse teachers increases the possibility of that. Having teachers that understand the cultural experience of kids helps that happen. We have a long way to go.
Donna, we were just talking a moment ago about staffing. Do early child care programs experience similar workforce challenges in terms of hiring and retaining employees?
Absolutely. A survey done in December showed that there were 2,600 vacancies in the early childhood sector, and that was among 700 programs, which represents a survey of just 10% of the sector. So we know that there are thousands of children on waiting lists, 26,000 in fact, and we know that if we had the staff, we could bring them in. And again, you know, you cannot begrudge somebody thinking, oh, I can earn $45,000 as a new teacher, or I could earn $28,000 as a childcare worker, or I could go work for Amazon and not only get that and health benefits and maybe some contribution to education. We are in this extraordinary situation where the private market wage rates have gone up. That's a good thing for a lot of Pennsylvanians. But the part of the labor market that's most dependent on public resources is not kept pace, and we got to change that.
One more question on workforce. What's being done to address the shortage of substitute teachers?
So there were some, laws passed and were sustained again in December when the school codes were passed. So that allows us to use a greater diversity of our retired teachers. We can bring our teachers back for as much time as we need them, and it opens the doors for us to use more substitutes in our school. So that certainly has helped us to do that. It still continues to be an issue. Just as the rest of the education workforce is, we still need more substitutes that can come into the classrooms and help support us as we're, again, working toward getting our number of certified teachers up to the level that we need them to fill our classrooms. So it's a problem.
Hannah, I'd like to bring you back into the discussion. What role do cyber schools and charter schools have in the budget discussion?
So one of the things that Governor Shapiro included in his budget proposal was something that we have seen in various iterations over the past couple of years from Governor Wolf. He proposed setting a flat rate for cyber charter school tuition at $8,000. And so right now, if a student from a school district attends a cyber charter school, the cyber charter school is receiving an amount from each individual school district based on the costs in that individual school district. So one single cyber charter is receiving 500 completely different tuition amounts for every kid that is being educated in their school. So this would set a flat rate tuition for cyber charter at $8,000, and again would reduce relatively significantly, provide some relief for school districts who have seen that as a growing area in their budget. So school districts districts are paying roughly $3 billion to brick and mortar and cyber charter schools for students attending. This would provide some relief on that front just for those attending cyber charter schools.
How do cyber charter schools compare to brick and mortar schools in terms of not only cost but also accountability?
Yeah, so certainly this has been a topic of discussion since I think 1997 when the charter school law was passed. A lot of difference of opinion, I think, in terms of how successful and the purpose of those schools, how successful they are at providing students with sort of quality education. Certainly, if you look at some of the proficiency data, the performance data, cyber charter schools often are sort of performing in the bottom. And so I think from that perspective, in comparison to brick and mortar public schools, in addition to the fact that as cyber charter schools, they certainly do not have the same cost structure that brick and mortar public schools do. I think that is probably why we have seen so much more momentum focused on trying to provide some relief to school districts and target that reform at cyber charter schools.
Do you think that since the pandemic and that shift to online learning during the year that a lot of people were working or going to school from home, has that changed public perception of cyber schools?
I think what we saw during the pandemic was we saw a huge shift in the number of students attending cyber charter schools, in 1920, 2021. That has started to come down. And so I think, students have shifted back to sort of traditional brick and mortar schools. And so we'll sort of see what that trend looks like. Certainly, there are still a significant number of students attending cyber charter schools. School districts have worked really hard over time to develop their own cyber options. So for a student that might have a difficult schedule, they might be, in a program where they're, a rigorous ballet training or something else. There are school districts that have really developed very strong, robust cyber programs to really be able to accommodate the needs, the unique needs of every individual student. So there certainly is a lot of work, a lot of tax dollars that have been put in, and I think we have seen over time some mitigation of that sort of initial pandemic shift to cyber charter schools.
A significant part of the governor's initiatives also included what happens after a student graduates. He looked at technical education. He had some proposals for restructuring the higher education system. For the here and now, what can be done to better prepare a student, whether they're deciding to go to college, technical school, or to enter the workforce?
Yeah, so with the certainly that's something that we look at through our K-12 school programs, certainly. And I think with some of the recent decisions that have been made on some of the mandates, our schools are really looking at their high school programs and how we can help better prepare our students for their next pathway in their career. So we should be looking at, I used to say, we look at students and think, how do we get them ready to cross the stage to get their diploma? And that was the preparation that you were doing. It's no longer. Or we should be looking at how do we prepare our students for their next step in life. So it's post walking across that stage that we should be preparing students. So looking at what and personalizing those opportunities for students in our high school careers is really something that I think we're having a lot of discussions for and opening those doors to allow our students to have apprenticeships, to go out and do some volunteer work, to go out for dual enrollment courses is huge right now, and to allow our students the opportunity to go to their local colleges or trade school as needed, and to get into our businesses and have those experiences so that by the time they're walking out the door or walking across that stage with their diploma, they know exactly where they're going and where their passions are for their future. So we're really excited about that work and really digging into that to do whatever we can to make sure that our students feel very prepared for their adult life.
Now that Governor Shapiro has laid out his budget plan, what will each of your organizations do to emphasize what your priorities are for the coming year? Donna, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, apropos the caller who called about school choice, people do have choice in Pennsylvania between bricks and mortar charter, cyber charter, public schools. And to Hannah's point, these cyber charters are among the bottom performing schools in the state. I also want to point out, though, to that caller that we're spending $1 billion on cyber schools, and they are sitting on $250 million of surplus. So the governor's proposal is really going right into her issue, which is if we're going to have choice, we need to do it responsibly. And having these huge surpluses really begs the question of what's going on, especially how poorly the performance of the schools. Where we're going to focus is trying to make sure that the governor's putting his energy in to support the House Democrats to pass this budget out of the House so that the Senate has something to work from. That's a high watermark on the full level of what the governor's proposed. We'd love to see it also include more money to the point you just raised for career technical education. In fact, that is the first choice of many high school students. Our career tech ed programs are full. There are waiting lists. And we can't admit more children. We only have about 7% of the kids in the state there. So the $2.4 million that the governor put in the table for career tech ed doesn't cut it in terms of creating the kind of opportunity that prepares kids for a future, whether it's apprenticeship, dual enrollment, or through a VOTEC program. And that's a priority of ours and where we'll be looking to work across the aisle and build more support for those resources.
Sherri, what priorities will you emphasize this year?
I think we have a lot of work to, now that the governor set the stage for us. I think there's a lot of discussions and work that needs to happen with members of our General Assembly in regards to the funding. Again, special education is an area that I hope to advocate for, that we can get additional funding there. But we need those dollars, and I think there's a lot of discussions to make sure that they get across the full stage themselves so that we can have them for our schools. But then again, we're working strongly with our superintendents and school leaders across the Commonwealth now that we have hopefully these dollars and hopefully the additional dollars for equity across the Commonwealth. How do we prepare our schools and provide the additional opportunities and resources that our students need to be successful in their careers? So spending a lot of time talking about the hope for the additional dollars and how we use them, as well as ensuring that we advocate that those dollars actually do make it to our schools this year.
And Hannah, you get the last word.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said, really focused on ensuring that the significant investment that has been proposed makes it into a final budget, hopefully with some increases for special education, some increases for career and technical education as well, and really ensuring that those dollars can be used in a way that really gets the students and we're able to sort of mitigate some of the mandated costs, which is where a lot of these dollars would go otherwise. So.
I'd like to thank our guests, Hannah Barrick, Sherri Smith, and Donna Cooper. Ladies, thank you all for joining us. PCN's Larry Kaspar spoke with former Representative Joe Adams about his proposal to require cursive writing to be taught in schools.
Welcome to our program. How big a priority is teaching cursive writing in school nowadays?
Not as big as it should be. That's why I'm running the bill. It's not required of all public schools in Pennsylvania, but there are 22 states that it is.
So why should kids learn this skill, in your opinion?
Well, there's the scientific evidence points to it. Psychology Today, doctors of psychology, doctors of neurology, doctors of education all have written many articles and many discussions that it's really important for brain development for young people. That's number one. Number two, historical documents are all written in cursive, and therefore to be able to read them and to study them, it's important. Number three, being able to sign your name is important to be able to open a checking account or buy a house or record a deed or get a driver's license. So those three applications, that's why I think it's important.
And I was looking at your press release before this interview, and you said that it can improve critical thinking. Give me an example of what you're saying there.
Well, the psychology and scientific evidence says that cursive writing allows people for right brain and left brain to work together. It allows people to have complete, not fractured thinking, to be able to start a thought and complete it, and cursive points to that as well. But the right brain, left brain, and sense of achievement, as well as artistic and hand-eye coordination.
Now, I also understand, according to your office, cursive can increase self-confidence. I think that surprised me.
Well, I think about it when you're a third grader, and people want to be able to show that you've accomplished something, and then, in a sense of accomplishment, also makes people feel good about themselves. So to be able to see a letter and then reproduce it, and then produce words and sentences gives young people a sense of accomplishment.
Now, here's something that brings this discussion right up to date, and that's the consideration of AI, artificial intelligence. And again, this came out of your office. The cursive writing can separate what you called, I think, human work from that of artificial intelligence. Why is that important? Give me an example.
Well, I mean, obviously, artificial intelligence is more and more items are going that direction, and a cursive signature and just like a fingerprint is something that's unique to everybody, and it's much more difficult to mimic somebody's cursive handwriting than it is printed text.
And now that you use the word mimic, that makes me think of an unrelated problem. That has to do with plagiarism in school. And just how big a problem is that these days, since so many works are available to be copied, misapprehended?
Sure. Well, and again, text, it's much easier. And if it's written in cursive and it's your personal handwriting, there is a personality that comes to it, but also, it's much less easy to be reproduced if it's in cursive.
Now, tell me about your personal experience learning cursive. You told me before we got started that you did it in elementary school.
Correct.
Do you remember that experience and what feeling of, reward?
Sure.
Did
Yeah.
you feel?
So it was great. I mean, above the blackboard, and I'm old enough that it was a blackboard at the time. There were the green plates, the large case and lowercase cursive, and third grade. I remember it was Mrs. Hunter, and at the Hawley Elementary School, and it was a real sense of accomplishment. It's one of the areas that I didn't do well in. Handwriting was actually graded, but it was a scenario where once you were able to do it and produce words, sentences, and quite honestly, your name, it was a great feeling for a young person who's 8 years old.
Now, let's talk more about your bill. I understand that you want cursive to be taught at what you called an appropriate grade level. So why leave that part of the bill open-ended, especially considering your experience from third grade?
Right. Well, I think that, I spent some time in the education business, and we always were getting mandates, and mandates, unfunded in a general basis. So I think that it's important for the people at the local level to know what level their students are, to be able to teach it when it's most appropriate for them. There might be third grade for the average elementary student, but it might be fourth or fifth grade for somebody who might have some challenges, and I really want to leave that up to local control.
Tell me more about your involvement in what you called the education business a minute ago. I'd like to hear about that, because I have a hunch it informs what we're talking about here today.
Sure. So I'm not a professional educator, but I was a business manager. I was a finance economics undergrad and with an MBA, and I spent 13 years as a business manager at a public school, Wallenpaupack, and then 15 years in the private sector, and then 2 years back as a superintendent. And superintendents, not being an educator, I relied on the really high-end professional teaching corps and administrators to do the academic things. So, and one of those things, every email that I've received, except two, have been, this is really important, and it's really important. And those are mostly
Who's sending you those? Parents, that's what I'm getting at.
Parents, professional educators, retired educators, lawyers, and historians. A historian, the local Wayne County Historical Society, Carol Dunn, wanted to hire somebody to do some research, and a student came, a college student with a history major, couldn't do the task because what she needed to have research was written in cursive and he couldn't read it.
So I figure there must have been some event or inspiration that made you one day say, I got to write a bill about this.
Well, it really came from the education department of the House of Representatives. Diane Ackrey suggested it with Matt Hilliard, who's the counsel, and said, would you take a look at this and maybe consider it? And I did, and with that in mind, it was like, oh, this makes great sense. Not to mention the person whose actual handwriting are on those little plaques above the blackboard live in Wayne County.
How much support are you getting from your colleagues?
22 co-sponsors, both sides of the aisle. It's not a partisan issue, so and huge amount of emails and correspondence from the general public.
Representative Joe Adams, thank you very much.
Awesome, great, thank you, appreciate it.
That concludes today's show. Join us for another episode of the PCN Capitol Preview. We'll discuss how Governor Shapiro's budget proposal will impact business tomorrow starting at 9 a.m. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.